The wind off the Pacific carried a cold dampness that settled over the small town of Astoria, Oregon, on the night of November 3, 2003. The streets glistened under the orange glow of streetlights, rain pooling in uneven cobblestone alleys that wound toward the docks. At the edge of town, where the Columbia River met the sea, 28-year-old Heather Lang locked up the Marine Research Station where she worked and stepped into the misty night. Her breath came out in pale clouds as she walked toward her car, her messenger bag slung across one shoulder, its strap worn from years of use. She had been studying estuarine ecosystems for a grant project tied to Oregon State University, spending late nights analyzing water samples and data. Those who knew her described her as meticulous, kind, and quietly ambitious, the sort of person who rarely left a task unfinished. Heather's apartment was less than 10 minutes from the research station, just past a narrow bridge that crossed a tidal channel. She was expected home by 9:30 that night, but she never arrived. When her roommate Claire Jennings awoke the next morning, Heather's bed was undisturbed. Her car was not in the driveway. Her phone, found later inside her office, had been left charging on the desk, an uncharacteristic oversight for someone so careful. At first, police treated her disappearance as a missing persons case with no sign of foul play. Astoria, a coastal community known for its quiet nights and fishing culture, wasn't accustomed to violent crime. Investigators searched along the riverbanks and roadside ditches, focusing on the short route Heather would have taken home. Her colleagues reported that she had stayed late at work running tests, leaving around 8:45 p.m. A surveillance camera at the marina captured her walking toward the parking lot, carrying her bag, umbrella in hand. Beyond that, the trail vanished into the dark. Within 48 hours, the case grew increasingly alarming. Heather's car, a silver 1998 Subaru Outback, was discovered abandoned near the base of the Astoria-Megler Bridge, its driver's side door unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Mud on the tire suggested it had been driven onto a service road before being moved. Inside, police found Heather's coat and one of her gloves, but her bag was missing. The location was strange, far from her normal route and near the docks where few people went after dark. Detective Alan Mercer, a veteran with the Clatsop County Sheriff's Department, was assigned to lead the investigation. He had seen his share of missing person cases, but something about this one felt different, deliberate. Search teams, including volunteers and local Coast Guard units, combed the shoreline and wooded embankments. Helicopters scanned the water for days. Yet no trace of Heather emerged. A handful of witnesses came forward with fragmented memories. One longshoreman reported seeing a dark pickup truck idling near the bridge that night, its headlights off. Another recalled hearing raised voices near the service road sometime after 9 p.m., though the rain and distance made it impossible to distinguish words. These leads, though tantalizing, never solidified into evidence. By early December, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. Heather's parents, Michael and Ruth Lang, drove from Eugene to assist in the search. They distributed flyers, spoke to local media, and pleaded for information. "Our daughter doesn't just disappear," Ruth told reporters, her voice trembling. "Someone knows something." Community vigils were held on the riverfront, candles flickering against the damp night air. Despite the town's collective effort, the mystery deepened. In early 2004, detectives received a tip that a fisherman had found a torn piece of fabric snagged on driftwood along the eastern shore, a corner of what appeared to be a canvas messenger bag. Forensic testing identified it as consistent with the material of Heather's missing bag, but the fragment was too small to yield additional clues. With no body, no witness capable of identifying a suspect, and no significant forensic evidence, the case entered the realm of uncertainty. Detective Mercer kept the file open longer than most. He returned to the bridge periodically, walking the same narrow road where Heather's car had been found, searching for something he might have missed. Each year, he sent samples for reanalysis, hoping that advancing technology might uncover what 2003's methods could not. But as months turned into years, hope thinned. By 2008, the Lang case was considered a cold file. Heather's family moved back to Eugene, holding annual memorials but never giving up entirely. Mercer, who retired in 2012, left a handwritten note in the file before transferring it to the Oregon State Cold Case Unit. This one never sat right. Check everything again when science catches up. It would take more than a decade for that moment to arrive. In 2020, Detective Aaron Callahan joined the Cold Case Unit in Salem, tasked with re-examining unsolved disappearances across Oregon's coastal counties. Among the boxes she inherited, Heather Lang's file caught her attention. The details: a meticulous researcher, a short drive home, a car abandoned under strange circumstances, felt unfinished. Callahan approached the case as both investigator and archivist, cataloging every piece of physical evidence that still existed. The evidence logs contained several items collected in 2003 that had never been fully analyzed. The torn piece of canvas, a glove, and debris scraped from the undercarriage of Heather's Subaru. Technological advances in forensic science now allowed testing that had been impossible 2 decades earlier. Working with Dr. Leo Martinez at the Oregon State Crime Lab, Callahan requested full DNA and fiber analysis on all items. Months of quiet work followed. In early 2021, the lab delivered a breakthrough. Traces of male DNA were found on the torn canvas fragment. Partial, but sufficient for database comparison. When run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system, it matched a profile from a man with a 2009 conviction for assault in neighboring Tillamook County, 45-year-old Raymond Ray Hensley. Hensley had been a dock worker in Astoria during the early 2000s, known locally for erratic behavior and a history of bar fights. He left town in 2004, relocating to Idaho after losing his job. Police had interviewed him briefly in the original investigation, but his statement that he had been at home the night Heather vanished was never contradicted by evidence at the time. The new DNA match changed everything. Detective Callahan began reconstructing Hensley's movements from 2003. Employment. Records placed him on a night shift at the marina within walking distance of where Heather's car was found. A co-worker, when re-interviewed, remembered that Hensley had left work early that evening, claiming he felt ill. Another recalled seeing his pickup truck near the bridge around the time Heather was last seen. Callahan and her team obtained a search warrant for Hensley's Idaho residence. Though nearly 2 decades had passed, forensic technicians carefully examined items from his garage and storage shed. Among them was a faded canvas duffel bag with fibers microscopically consistent with those on Heather's recovered glove. Soil samples from the bag matched sediment unique to the Columbia River estuary, the same region where her car had been discovered. The evidence, though circumstantial at first glance, began to form a cohesive narrative. In late 2003, Hensley had access to the same roads and parking areas Heather used daily. His truck matched witness descriptions from the night of the disappearance. The combination of the DNA match, fiber analysis, and geologic consistency of soil traces created a web of connections that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. In July 2021, Oregon State Police, with assistance from Idaho authorities, executed an arrest warrant. Hensley, then 63, was taken into custody without resistance at his home outside Coeur d'Alene. When questioned, he maintained his innocence but appeared visibly shaken upon learning that new forensic evidence had linked him to the case. News of the arrest spread quickly across Oregon, reigniting memories of a case that had haunted the coastal community for nearly 2 decades. Residents of Astoria gathered once again near the riverfront, holding candles in memory of Heather Lang. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a confirmation that patience and progress could finally bring justice to the forgotten. Detective Callahan addressed reporters the following day. "This case shows that no amount of time can hide the truth," she said. Every file deserves another look because somewhere inside it a voice is still waiting to be heard. As Heather's parents stood before cameras, their expressions were a mix of relief and quiet grief. "We never stopped believing," Ruth said softly. "Now we can finally let her rest." For Astoria, the resolution of the 2003 disappearance felt like the closing of an old wound. But for investigators across Oregon, it became something more. Proof that persistence combined with the relentless march of technology could bring light even to the darkest corners of time. When Raymond Hensley was transported back to Oregon in August 2021, the mood inside the Clatsop County Courthouse was a strange mixture of relief and unease. For 2 decades, the town had whispered theories about what happened to Heather Lang. Some believed she had been abducted by a stranger passing through. Others thought she might have fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. But now the man who once worked beside those waters, who had drunk in the same harbor bars as the search volunteers, stood accused of ending her life. Detective Erin Callahan spent the weeks following the arrest assembling every detail that could solidify the case for prosecution. She meticulously reconstructed the events of November 3, 2003, piecing together timelines, witness statements, and forensic results into a coherent sequence. The key, she knew, was not only proving Hensley's presence at the scene but demonstrating that his actions were deliberate and connected to Heather's disappearance beyond any reasonable doubt. Investigators obtained employment logs showing that Hensley had clocked out of his shift at
8:52 p.m. precisely,
the window in which Heather had left the research station. Surveillance footage from a gas station near the bridge, enhanced using modern digital restoration, captured a blurry image of a dark pickup resembling Hensley's passing through the intersection at 9:04 p.m. A streetlight reflection on the hood provided just enough detail for analysts to match its distinctive dent pattern to photographs of Hensley's old Ford F-150. Callahan revisited witnesses who had spoken to police back in 2003. Many had aged, moved away, or tried to forget the details of that night, but with patience and care, fragments of memory resurfaced. One dock worker remembered seeing Hensley near the service road that evening, smoking under the bridge and staring toward the parking area. Another recalled that he seemed unusually agitated the next morning, muttering about people sticking their noses where they didn't belong. When shown old photographs, both men confirmed Hensley as the person they had seen. The forensic case strengthened steadily. The DNA from the torn canvas fragment matched Hensley's profile, with a statistical probability exceeding 1 in a billion. A second sample taken from Heather's glove revealed touch DNA from an unknown male contributor, later identified through reanalysis as consistent with Hensley's genetic markers. Combined with the soil evidence and fiber matches, the pattern was undeniable. Still, Detective Callahan understood that the passage of time created vulnerabilities. Memories faded, records deteriorated, and defense attorneys would seize upon every procedural weakness. She coordinated with the Oregon Department of Justice to ensure every piece of evidence was retested, revalidated, and documented according to modern standards. Each report was reviewed twice, every chain of custody confirmed. The smallest error, she told her team, can unravel 20 years of work. When the indictment was formally filed in September 2021, the charges included first-degree kidnapping, first-degree murder, and unlawful disposal of remains. The latter charge stemmed from new evidence discovered during searches of property once owned by Hensley's former employer, a disused storage yard adjacent to the docks. Ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbed soil beneath an old supply shed. Forensic excavation unearthed small fragments of bone and cloth fibers matching Heather's jacket. DNA confirmed the remains as hers. That discovery brought a wave of emotion across the investigation. For Heather's family, it ended 18 years of searching and wondering. For detectives, it validated their commitment. For the community, it reopened wounds thought to be closed. News outlets from across the state descended on Astoria, broadcasting live updates from the courthouse steps. Headlines read, Oregon 2003 cold case solved, arrest shocked community. As the pretrial hearings began, prosecutors outlined the story they intended to present to a jury. According to their reconstruction, Heather Lang had left the Marine Research Station shortly before 9, walking alone toward her car in the rain. Hensley, who had left work minutes earlier, saw her pass the dockyard gate. Investigators believed he followed her in his truck, intercepting her near the bridge under the pretext of conversation or offering a ride. When she declined, an altercation occurred. The evidence suggested a brief struggle, a torn strap, a glove ripped from her hand, before she was forced into the vehicle. What followed remained uncertain, but prosecutors contended that Hensley drove her to the dockyard storage yard, where she was killed and her body concealed beneath the shed. During interrogation, Hensley denied all involvement. He claimed never to have met Heather Lang, dismissing the DNA evidence as contamination. "They're trying to pin an old ghost on me," he told detectives. "I didn't touch that woman." Yet when confronted with the forensic consistency, the matching fibers, the soil composition identical to the Columbia estuary, the witness statements, his responses grew evasive. He admitted to being near the bridge but insisted it was a coincidence. Detective Callahan documented the entire session. Though Hensley offered no confession, his shifting accounts provided prosecutors with valuable leverage. Inconsistencies about his timeline, vehicle location, and interactions with co-workers painted a portrait of deception. The district attorney's office prepared meticulously for trial, knowing that a jury would expect more than science alone after nearly 2 decades. They built a narrative that balanced forensic precision with human context. Prosecutors planned to begin by reintroducing Heather Lang, her life, her aspirations, her devotion to environmental science. They would show photographs from her fieldwork along the estuary, smiling in hip waders with a sampling pole in hand. They wanted the jury to see the person, not just the evidence. As 2022 began, the courtroom filled with quiet anticipation. For the Lang family, the wait had been unbearably long. For the investigators, the culmination of tireless work. For the public, a reckoning. On the first day of trial, the prosecution laid out its case in calm, deliberate tones. They displayed a map of Astoria, tracing Heather's route from the research station to the bridge. They marked the point where her car was found, the service road leading to the dockyard, and finally the storage yard where her remains were discovered. Expert witnesses followed, describing in precise language how the DNA samples were recovered, amplified, and matched. Dr. Martinez from the Oregon State Crime Lab testified about the advancements that made this breakthrough possible. Next-generation sequencing, capable of extracting viable profiles from degraded samples. What was impossible in 2003, he told the jury, is now routine. The defense countered by attacking the reliability of long-term evidence. They questioned how items stored for 18 years could remain uncontaminated, how witness memories could survive unchanged. They portrayed Hensley as a scapegoat, a rough but harmless man whose prior record made him an easy target. Defense attorney Laura Pierce reminded the jury that absence of confession and eyewitnesses left reasonable doubt. The state wants you to bridge 2 decades with assumption, she argued. Science may evolve, but certainty does not. Despite her arguments, the prosecution's case remained formidable. The physical evidence, DNA, fibers, soil, and timeline, created a lattice of facts difficult to dismantle. Witness recollections, though imperfect, overlapped enough to form a consistent narrative. And the emotional weight of Heather's story lingered in the courtroom like the damp air outside. Reporters covered every session. The Oregonian ran a series titled The River's Secret: How Science Solved a 2003 Mystery. Television crews filmed outside the courthouse as locals gathered silently with candles and signs reading "Justice for Heather." Each day her parents sat in the same seats, listening to testimony that alternated between heartbreak and vindication. Detective Callahan testified on the 8th day, her voice steady as she recounted the process of reopening the file. "It started with a piece of fabric," she told the jury. "Something small enough to fit in my hand. But inside that fragment was a story that had waited 18 years to be heard." She explained how each discovery, the DNA match, the fiber comparison, the soil trace, formed a chain linking Hensley to the scene. Her professionalism, combined with quiet conviction, left a lasting impression. As the trial progressed into its 3rd week, the defense attempted to introduce alternative theories, suggesting that Heather might have encountered another individual after leaving work, or that the DNA transfer could have occurred through secondary contact at the marina, but prosecutors countered effectively, emphasizing the specificity of the genetic match and the geographic correlation of all evidence. By early April 2022, closing arguments approached. Both sides prepared to deliver final statements that would determine how the past 18 years would be remembered, as a tragedy explained or as an enduring mystery unresolved. When closing arguments began, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The long arc of nearly 2 decades of silence, speculation, and sorrow was about to converge in a single verdict. Every person seated in that wood-paneled room seemed to carry the weight of the years since 2003, when Heather Lang vanished into the rain-soaked darkness of an Astoria night. The prosecution opened with quiet, deliberate precision. District Attorney Melissa Grant stepped before the jury, her voice steady but solemn. She did not begin with evidence or law. She began with Heather. She was 28 years old, Grant said, projecting an image on the courtroom screen. Heather standing knee-deep in water, collecting samples, her smile framed by early morning fog. A daughter. A scientist. A person who believed in caring for the world she studied. And on November 3, 2003, she was taken from that world. Not by accident, not by chance, but by the deliberate act of one man. Grant paced slowly, letting silence punctuate her words. Then she began to reconstruct the case piece by piece, weaving a timeline that felt inescapable in its clarity. Heather leaves the Marine Research Station at 8:47 p.m. Hensley clocks out at 8:52. Surveillance shows his truck driving past the bridge minutes later. A torn strap, a glove with his DNA, soil from his storage yard beneath her fingernails, each connection laid carefully before the jury. "This isn't coincidence," Grant continued. "It's consistency. The kind that science and truth refuse to let fade." She described how modern DNA testing, impossible in 2003, had allowed investigators to see what time once concealed. She explained how the soil under Hensley's truck matched sediment unique to the Columbia estuary, how fibers in his duffel bag aligned with those on Heather's belongings, and how his own changing statements betrayed his guilt. Then came the emotional pivot, the reminder that beneath the forensics was a life stolen. Heather Lang left her workplace expecting to go home. She never did. But her voice, through the evidence she left behind, spoke to us across 18 years. And today you are the ones who decide whether that voice will finally be heard. The defense followed. Attorney Laura Pierce's tone was calm, but insistent. "This is not about sympathy," she said, glancing briefly toward Heather's parents. "It's about certainty. The state wants you to bridge 2 decades of missing information with technology and faith. But faith is not proof. DNA, fibers, soil, all can be misinterpreted or mishandled. Memories fade. Witnesses forget. The key state is asking you to convict a man not for what can be proven beyond doubt, but for what feels comforting after years of not knowing." She reminded the jury that the burden of proof lay entirely with the prosecution. Mr. Hensley may be imperfect. He may have lived a rough life. But imperfection is not guilt. It was a strong argument, one designed to sow hesitation rather than persuasion, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to hold its breath between logic and emotion. When the case went to the jury, the deliberations stretched for 3 long days. Reporters camped outside, the courthouse lawn dotted with camera crews and locals who had followed the story since the beginning. Rain came and went in waves, soaking the steps and windows, echoing the night of Heather's disappearance. Inside, the Lang family waited quietly in the gallery, their hands clasped, faces lined with the exhaustion of years. Finally, on the afternoon of April 11, 2022, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood. On the charge of first-degree kidnapping, he read, "We find the defendant, Raymond Hensley, guilty." A pause. "On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and irreversible. Heather's mother pressed her hands to her face, tears spilling freely. Her father bowed his head. Detectives Callahan and Martinez exchanged a glance, not of triumph, but of quiet relief. Hensley sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable. Judge Ellen Marks thanked the jury for their service and set the sentencing hearing for the following month. Outside, as news broke, the phrase that had defined the case spread across local and national headlines. Oregon 2003 cold case solved, arrest shocked community. The trial's conclusion marked more than the end of a legal process. For the people of Astoria, it felt like the closing of a chapter that had haunted their community's conscience. Heather's disappearance had lingered for so long that it had become part of local folklore, whispered at bars, discussed in classrooms, referenced in annual vigils. Now it had a name, a narrative, and a measure of justice. At the sentencing hearing in May 2022, the courtroom filled again, quieter this time, as the Lang family prepared to speak. Hensley, in a faded suit provided by the state, was led into the room, shackles faintly clinking. He refused to look toward the gallery. Michael Lang stood first. His voice trembled at the edges, but his words were resolute. "For 18 years, my wife and I woke every morning wondering if today would be the day we heard her voice again, or found the answer to what happened. That day has finally come, and it hurts as much as it heals. But we're grateful to everyone who refused to forget our daughter." Ruth Lang followed, her statement brief but piercing. "You took someone who made the world better," she said softly, addressing Hensley without anger. "We can't undo that, but we can make sure she's remembered not for what you did, but for who she was." Judge Marks sentenced Hensley to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing the calculated cruelty and prolonged deception of his actions. Her final words resonated through the room. Time delayed justice, but it did not deny it. In the weeks that followed, Oregon's cold case unit received a surge of renewed attention and funding. Heather's case became a benchmark example of persistence, demonstrating the power of forensic advancements to rewrite the endings of long-forgotten stories. The Oregon Department of Justice issued a statement acknowledging the collaboration between state and local agencies, praising the investigators who refused to let time bury truth. Detective Aaron Callahan, whose methodical work had reignited the case, avoided the spotlight. She continued working quietly in Salem, reviewing other dormant files. When asked by a journalist what Heather's case meant to her, she replied simply, "It's proof that silence isn't the same as closure. Every unanswered question is still waiting somewhere for the right person to ask again." The case's influence extended beyond Oregon. Law enforcement agencies in Washington and Idaho began reevaluating their own unsolved cases, particularly those involving evidence collected before the mid-2000s, when DNA preservation standards were inconsistent. National Crime Lab cited the Lang investigation as an example of how partial, degraded samples could now be reprocessed using microsequencing technology. In professional circles, the case became a touchstone for perseverance and precision, a reminder that science, though methodical and slow, could carry moral weight. For the community of Astoria, healing came in small, deliberate gestures. A memorial plaque was installed at the Marine Research Station where Heather had worked, engraved with her name and a line from her graduate thesis. To understand the balance of nature is to protect its promise. Students from Oregon State's Environmental Science program visited the site each year, leaving flowers and handwritten notes. Her former colleagues organized an annual scholarship in her name, funding young women pursuing marine ecology research. In interviews, locals often said that Heather's story had changed how they saw their town, that it reminded them how easily tragedy could hide behind routine, and how deeply a community could rally when confronted with loss. "We all felt like we knew her," one resident told a reporter. "And now we feel like we helped bring her home." Meanwhile, in prison, Hensley remained largely silent. He declined interviews, avoided appeals, and lived in isolation from the general population. Corrections officers described him as detached, sometimes pacing his cell for hours. When asked by a prison chaplain if he wanted to discuss the case, he reportedly said only, "The river kept its secret too long." Years later, the Oregon State Crime Lab used Heather's case in training programs for new forensic analysts, emphasizing how persistence and careful documentation could revive even the most fragile evidence. Her story appeared in true crime documentaries and academic journals, yet through it all, her family remained private, content that the world finally understood the truth. By 2024, 2 decades after Heather's disappearance, Astoria held a public remembrance at the Riverside Park near the old docks. The evening was overcast, the air cool and still. Families, students, and police officers gathered, lighting candles that reflected on the slow-moving water. Detective Callahan attended quietly, standing apart from the crowd. When asked to speak, she declined at first, then stepped forward and said just one sentence. "Heather's story isn't about a crime. It's about what happens when people refuse to stop looking." The audience fell silent, the sound of the tide the only reply.